I would like to welcome you all to the third seminar of the CSS seminar series of the Spring 2026 academic semester. We have the great pleasure of hosting Dr. Martin Saveski from the University of Washington today. It's a very interesting talk. We are indeed excited to hear about his work. Before I give the floor to Dr. Saveski, I'd like to introduce him to those of you who are not familiar with his work, though I'm pretty sure that most of you are, at least our students who are with us today taking our seminar class, I suppose, are familiar. Dr. Saveski's research sits at the intersection of computational social sciences, machine learning, and network analysis, with a particular focus on understanding how digital platforms shape social behavior and political attitudes online. His work develops methods for analyzing large-scale social data and uses these insights into form the design of healthier digital social systems. Most of his recent research examines social media algorithms and their societal consequences, including their role in political polarization and effective animosity, as well as how platform design can influence the quality of online conversations. Before joining the University of Washington, Martin was a postdoc researcher at Stanford University, and he researched his PhD from MIT back in 2020. Earlier in his career, he also worked in industry research through internships at Yahoo Labs, Amazon, LinkedIn, and Facebook, experiences that continue to inform his work on real-world digital platforms. So today he will present his talk titled Reranking Partisan Animosity in Algorithmic Social Media Feeds, Alters Effective Polarization. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Marta. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Mary. Thank you for having me. Very excited to be with you today. So today I'll talk about a randomized experiment on feed ranking algorithms in which we were interested in measuring the effects of down and up ranking polarizing content. And so we have been working on this project for quite a while, for about 2.5 years, and I'm really excited to share the results with you. It was published in Science 3, 4 months ago. So I will actually drop a link to the paper for those of you that want to read a little bit more. And so interesting things to talk about. This is joint work with my stellar collaborators, Tiziano Picardi, who is now on the faculty at Johns Hopkins, Chenyan Jia from Northeastern, Jeff Hancock from Stanford Communications, Jeannie Tsai from Stanford Psychology, and then Michael Bernstein, who is in the computer science department. As you can see, we have a pretty interdisciplinary group, and it really required all of that expertise to bring all of this together. So the title really kind of emphasizes the intervention part of this work. And it is an intervention that is aimed at reducing affective polarization. But it's also about a methodology for more broadly running this kind of feed ranking experiments of the type that I will describe without the cooperation of the platforms. So we see this as a very important contribution of this work. But we also think that there is a sort of a broader framework here for designing ranking objectives for feed algorithms. So I'll focus on the intervention, but I'll touch on the methodology and framework as I go. So there is this question, idea, feeling that social media causes affective polarization. We don't have too many studies that experimentally try to examine this link. But I'll lay out the most common hypothesis of how people believe that this might be going on, what might be the mechanism. And you may have heard of this as sort of the filter bubble hypothesis. But the idea is the following, is that feed ranking algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, have an asterisk there, probably not just that, they are looking at some other things. But I think it's not unfair to say that that's one of their primary objectives. They take a whole bunch of information about the user and the items that they're going to see, and they try to maximize, show them things that they're more likely to engage with. And so if that's the case, we know that people are more likely to engage or be interested in things that align with their views. And so if that's the case, then it's likely that the content that the algorithm serves them may be a lot more aligned with their political views. So they end up sort of in this little sketch that I have here in the middle. They end up being exposed to things that are coming from their own party rather than out party content. And then the worry is that you create these feedback loops where people see more of the content they agree with, they engage more with the content that they're shown of that content more often, they engage with it more and sort of in a flywheel, self-reinforcing loop. And the worry is that this leads to increase in affective polarization over time, essentially. And I'm thinking here of the sort of, I think of affective polarization as the feeling towards out partisans over time. Okay, so that's kind of the hypothesis. And if you believe in this hypothesis, as I have laid it out here, one natural thing to do is if you are interested in reducing affective polarization, is to try to essentially make this bar chart that I showed on the right to be a little bit more balanced, right? You can think of ways to have the in and out party content exposure to be as similar as possible. And you can do this in two ways. The first one is you can kind of increase that red bar. You can increase the exposure to out party content. And Levy in 2021 that's exactly what he attempted to do. He asked participants to subscribe to Facebook pages of out party news outlets. And this was a randomized experiment at the time. And he found that actually indeed led to decrease in polarization. You can also do the opposite, right? You can say, well, I'm going to actually kind of make that green bar a little smaller and make the overall exposure more balanced. And so another very noteworthy randomized experiment was one that was conducted during the big collaboration between Meta and academic researchers. And so in one of the key papers, Nihan et al. Tried to do exactly that. So they decreased exposure to content from like-minded sources on Facebook, and this included friends, groups, and pages. But interestingly, in this case, they found basically null results. They didn't find any effects on affective polarization. Okay. And as part of that same collaboration between Meta and academic researchers, there was another experiment that randomly switched people to a chronological feed, so a subset of them. But what's interesting, although the intervention was not designed to sort of decrease exposure to in-party content, it sort of had that effect unintentionally. So in this Guess et al. Paper, where people who were assigned to see chronological feeds, in fact, had increased exposure to moderate and mixed sources. So although it wasn't designed to sort of intervene on the kind of content they were seeing, it did have that effect. But in this case too, they didn't find any effects on affective polarization. So null results. And so there is this question of sort of why that might be and what is something else that we could do. And so, one important observation here is that not all in and out party content is the same. And if you think about sort of these interventions, they're relatively coarse. They essentially think about not much about the content, but rather who is posting the content, right? And what is the political leaning of the person or the page or the group that is sort of posting that content. And as I said, not all in and out party content is the same. And in fact, in the Nihan et al. Paper, I have highlighted one of the most interesting parts, which is they say, well, like-minded sources are actually the majority of what people see on the platform. But in fact, political information and news are only a small fraction of those exposures, right? So even if you're trying to get people to see things that are from the other party, you end up showing things that are not necessarily likely to change how people feel about the other party simply because they're not related to politics and news that much. Okay, and so that led us to think about this question of whether we can more directly model this expected causal link between sort of the algorithmic sorting and then affective polarization. And so then we had this question of like, if that's the case, what kind of content we expect to cause polarization? Okay, so that's sort of the setup. And there are many reasonable ways to answer that question. We decided to focus on anti-democratic attitudes and partisan animosity. We borrowed this idea from the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, which was sort of a big mega study that was run around out of Stanford that brought together a lot of researchers. Essentially, it was a challenge which invited researchers to propose interventions for reducing polarization. And they measured the effect of the interventions on the following 8 factors. And you can see, they're pretty varied. They go from things like partisan animosity and support for partisan violence, all the way to sort of social distance and social distrust. So they were interested in measuring the effects in this, but we actually kind of borrowed them from them, but we used them in a different way. Instead, we were interested in whether these constructs were expressed in the content that people were exposed to. That was kind of our idea as a definition of what might be a polarizing content. Okay. And the question that we were interested in was whether exposure to this kind of APA posts, polarizing posts, I'll call them APA for anti-democratic attitudes and partisan animosity, actually causes effective polarization. And the question we had was, if you kind of see this point in the middle where you have the default algorithm, if we exogenously move that dial to the left or to the right, in one case reducing exposure to such content, in the other increasing exposure to such content, are we going to see change in effective polarization, and how much, essentially? Okay. And so, as I said, one of the big contributions of this paper was this methodology for running randomized experiments without the cooperation of the platforms. And so to do this, we built a browser extension, which every time a participant opens their For You feed, we would, whenever they request the feed from Twitter, we would actually intercept the feed content that X had selected for them. And then we would send that to our server, analyze it, reorder it in the way that is relevant to their treatment condition, and then we will show it back to them in the browser. Okay, and so all of this is kind of behind the scenes and is invisible to the users. And one other benefit of using this kind of approach is that in addition to being able to reorder the feed, we also could essentially see and track how people engage with the content. And we could also insert some surveys, as I will tell you a little bit later. We think this is very important because it does give external researchers the ability to run experiments without sort of having the buy-in from the platforms, and to explore slightly different solutions that perhaps the platforms may not be willing to try. Okay, so once we had that in place, actually, so let me tell you a little bit about sort of what do we do in these 2 boxes when we do have the feed on our server. So when we take the original feed, we do this kind of 2-pass process. First, we go over all the posts that the participant would have seen in their feed, and we identify the political posts, and then the subset of political posts we score and re-rank based on this APA criteria that I described, and then we just show the updated feed in the participants' user interface. And so the way we did this, for the political post classification, we use this definition from Pew Research. And I'm mentioning it here because I'll tell you a little bit about how much political content we found. But I want to mention that it's a sort of a little bit broader definition. And as you can see here, it can be content about officials, activists, social issues, or news or current events, right? So it's a bit of a broader definition. And so to do this, we trained a Roberta model distilled from GPT-4, which was the state-of-the-art model at the time. And it was very highly accurate. So we had 91.6% F1 score on human labels. And this was really important because we had to have this local classifier that was extremely fast in scanning the posts. Now, once we had identified the political posts, then we wanted to score them on each of these 8 factors that I previously mentioned. And in this case, we classified something as APA if at least 4 of these 8 factors were present. Okay. We sort of experimented what was the right number, and we landed on 4. Like any threshold decision, you can go a little higher or lower, but we found 4 to be sort of a good compromise in terms of the accuracy of the predictions. And then the way we did this was actually we scored them in real time with GPT by literally querying the OpenAI models in real time. So we would have something like this where we have for each of the 8 factors, we would basically give a batch of, I believe it was about 30 posts at a time, and then score them and get back responses from OpenAI. And so this was kind of an interesting decision that required a lot of engineering to make it, parallelization and stuff to make it really quick, so that we don't keep the participants waiting too long. And so this whole process of taking the feed, the original feed, classifying it with the local classifier, and then scoring the political posts with OpenAI's models took about less than 3 seconds end to end, which was not too long for the participants to notice and be affected significantly by. And I have to give a lot of credit to my co-author Tiziano, who spent a lot of time engineering the system to make it sort of such a seamless experience. Okay, so that's sort of the way that the extension worked behind the scenes. And so what we wanted to do, as I said, was we would identify APA content, and sometimes for some people we wanted to downrank it, make it harder to reach, and for some people we would push it a little bit up, making it a little bit more likely for them to reach, and we randomly assign them to either of those. I will mention we did have a control group for each of these 2 cases, because the way we had placed some surveys, and I'm happy to say more, but we wanted to make sure we have a pretty good comparison for each of those. And so in addition to sort of these 2 treatment groups, we also had 2 control groups that I'll mention a little bit more later. Okay. So the experiment lasted for 10 days. It was over the period of 2 months, but each participant participated in the experiment for 10 days. We started with a pre-survey where we asked participants many questions, including this affective polarization question. That was the key question we had. And then the following 3 days, they were in a baseline period where nothing really happened. We didn't change their feeds in any way, but we did record and ask them some questions during that period. We recorded what they were seeing and how they engaged with the feed. And after 3 days, we started the intervention. So if they were in one of the treatment arms, they would have a slightly different experience. And then after day 10, we invited them to complete a post survey. Throughout this period, we actually, as you can see here, during the baseline and the intervention period, we randomly injected these in-feed surveys where we were interested in kind of measuring how people feel in the moment. So they looked just like a post. They were a little bit with a sort of brighter background so people can notice them. And there was a small slider where they could basically respond to the question and send their response. That was actually very useful measurement because it allowed us to understand, how people feel in the moment rather than that before and after. And as I said at the end, we invited them for this sort of longer survey, similar to the one we gave them at the beginning. All right. So we were focused on two main outcomes. The first one, as you could tell, was affective polarization. And we used the so-called feeling thermometer scale to measure affective polarization, which is the sort of most common way to measure affective polarization. And it asks, how do you feel about the out party? So if you're a Democrat, we will ask you about Republicans and the other way around. And when we showed people this in-feed surveys, we had this prefix asking basically the same question, but saying just at the moment, how do you feel about the other side? Um, right, and the scale goes from 0, very cold feeling towards the other party, to 100, feeling very warm. We were also interested in how people feel in general, and so we asked them, how much do you feel angry, sad, excited, and calm? And so this is a mix of sort of positive and negative emotions that we selected. We had to sort of narrow down the number of emotions we measured just because we couldn't measure too many things at the same time. And in fact, to reduce the cognitive load in the in-feed surveys, we would always run one positive and one negative emotion to ask the participants about. So that gave us a sense of not just how they feel about the other party, but how they feel in general. Okay, so just a high-level recap of the intervention. The way it works is that it intercepts the feed, identifies political posts, scores them on these 8 APA factors that we have, re-ranks them in real time, and then kind of injects these surveys in the feed that give us the ability to measure how people feel in the moment. Okay. And so with all of that in place, we recruited over 1,200 participants. The criteria was that we were focused sort of on the US, and so we had US adults. They had to be Democrats or Republicans. We expected that independents will have less political content, so that was one of our filtering criteria. And then, in fact, we had a screening survey in which we checked the amount of political content that they had in their feed. And if they had less than 5%, we did not invite them to the experiment. And that maintained about 73% of the screening participants. And the reasoning behind this is that if there's no political content, there is not much that our intervention will do to the feed. So really, the treatment will be very small. So we won't be able to see much of an effect. We ran this in the lead up to the presidential election, July 7th to August 24th. If you don't remember those times, there were a lot of unexpected events, including the attempt on Donald Trump's life. At that time, Joe Biden stepped down and Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee. The 2 national conventions. So things that we knew were coming, some things we knew were coming, but obviously a lot of things that we could not have predicted to have happened during that time. And so we also, the way we chose, the one big problem with this kind of experiments is that oftentimes they're underpowered, and one may worry that that's why we don't see a lot of effects. And so we were very careful to make sure that we designed this and chose the sample size carefully in order to make sure that we have enough power to detect meaningful effects. So in this case, we ran over 5 pilots as we were developing the intervention, and then we used that data to do power analysis and design the experiment to be able to detect at least 2 degrees on this 0 to 100 degree scale with 95% power. So we have if we have null effects, we knew that we were able to detect small effects. All right, so that's kind of the experimental setup. So let me tell you a little bit about sort of what the intervention did and then I'll move to what we found. So first of all, it's kind of useful, I think, to just kind of orient people a little bit. About a third of all the content that participants saw in their feed was political. So a fair amount of content. And as I said, some of these people were in the experiment because they had some amount, more than 5% of political content. But this was a little higher than we expected. And just to give you a sense, in the Facebook studies, this was about 13.4%. So of course, there is a difference in the sampling and the platforms, but it's useful to sort of get oriented. So about a third of what people saw was politics during that time. Now, out of those 30%, when we scored the posts on these 8 APA factors, you can see that about 30% had an APA score that was 4 or higher, which we led them to be classified as sort of APA or polarizing. And so overall, that's about 10.6% of the sort of total exposure in the feed were these posts that we were either going to down or up rank. Okay, so a significant amount to work with. And I should say this is kind of an important factor to in the design. You know, if you choose a construct that is very rare, the intervention is just not going to be strong enough to see any effects. And so we were kind of lucky to find sort of the thing that had the right frequency in the data. Okay, so what did the intervention do? Did it do the thing that we wanted it to do? So here on the x-axis, I'm showing you the experiment day. So for each participant, so they're following the timeline I described earlier. And on the y-axis is the average fraction of APA posts, so this polarizing posts per user. And as I said, the first 3 days are the baseline period. And you can see all 4 groups, the 2 treatment and the 2 control groups, they all have very similar rate of APA exposure, a little bit above 10%. And then as soon as the experiment starts, the control groups stay sort of at the same level throughout the experiment, but the increased exposure condition gets a small bump up. You can see it goes from sort of between 13 and 15%. And then the reduced exposure condition goes almost all the way down to 0. So they see very little of this APA content. It doesn't go all the way down to 0 because we slightly downrank them. So we don't delete the content. And this was kind of an intentional decision. People, if they sort of scrolled further down, they were still able to see it. But it just required a little bit more work from them to see it. And so as you can see at the bottom, these are not zeros, essentially. They could still be exposed to this kind of content. And one thing I wanted to mention is that you can see that sort of the 2 arms are a little asymmetric in the sense that the increased exposure bumps by a little bit, by some 3 to 5%, and then the other one goes all the way down to 0. And this was kind of an intentional decision on our end because we wanted to sort of minimize the potential harm that the increased exposure may have. Okay, so in some sense, the intervention did induce the exogenous variation that we wanted it to. I'll just briefly mention all of the analysis that I'll show you and the way that we plan to analyze the data was all pre-registered. I won't spend too much time on this besides to say that it's critical and sort of maybe useful for those of you who are thinking about kind of designing these kinds of experiments, being able to measure things pre-experiment and have some measurement of, for example, polarization or something before the experiment is very useful because it gives you a lot of statistical power for detecting much smaller effects, essentially. And so I think that's kind of the key thing, and all to say that we sort of pre-registered a lot of the way we were going to analyze the data, which I strongly recommend. It's both a useful exercise to sort of think through what you're going to do once you have the data, but also to prevent yourself from really trying all different things until you find something. Okay, so one big worry in these kinds of experiments is that we may not actually have very similar kinds of participants in the different treatment arms. So that's one of the things that we checked. But what we found was that the kinds of people we have in the different groups, the treatment and control groups, were actually very similar to each other on various background characteristics, demographics, and behavior that we looked at. So that looked good. Another concern is whether people drop from the study in a way that may be concerning. So we had relatively high dropout rate, which was 24.4%. In fact, maybe high for sort of typical experiments, but for this kind of experiments, online experiments, this is a very common rate. So we're not totally surprised, but we wanted to make sure that the people who dropped out first, they didn't drop out at different rates between different treatment arms, which we didn't find any asymmetry like that. But also that there was no asymmetry between the people that dropped out. So the kinds of people that stopped being in the study was very similar in both the treatment and the control groups across the four conditions. Okay. So I kind of want to pose this question, and I'll answer it myself. But I think it's kind of useful to think through, well, what do we expect to happen? And I wanted to put this context. We were doing this soon after the meta studies came out, which, as I said earlier, found null effects. And so we were really thinking through, well, if they had many more participants and were able to do this sort of much larger study, what are the things that we expect could find? And so our intuition was the following. We had this idea. So this is kind of my little sketch. The x-axis is time, and then the y-axis is affective polarization. We can think of that the feeling thermometer. And at the beginning, let's say in the pre-survey, we have someone be at this level, this horizontal bar, and in the post-survey at this level. And then kind of as they're browsing during the experiment, how do we expect that to change? And our intuition was that essentially that we won't see much of a difference between the pre and the post, just based on what we learned from the meta studies. But we did expect that when people see this kind of polarizing content, which I'm sort of denoting here as this red X's, they would actually start feeling a little worse about the other party, more polarized. But then, that will have a short-term effect, and then they will see other content, and perhaps that may go away. All to say that it will have sort of this short-lived effects, but which we would be able to capture with our in-feed surveys, but we weren't really sure that this kind of intervention will have a big pre and post experiment effect. Okay, so that was kind of our intuition, and I'll tell you in a little bit what we actually found. Okay, so what did we find? As I said, we measured the outcomes in two ways. One was by inserting this in-feed surveys, and the other one was the pre and post experiment comparison. So what we found was that when we re-ranked APA content to reduce exposure, that ends up in the moment making people feel 3.2 points on this feeling thermometer scale warmer towards the other party, so less polarization. And when we increase the exposure to APA content, we actually saw the opposite effect. So people feel worse, feel colder towards the other party, so -2.5 degrees. And to our surprise, as I said, we did not quite expect this to hold pre and post. We do see very, very similar and significant effects, similar kinds in the pre and post experimental measurement. So as you can see, the effects are a little smaller, especially in the reduced condition. It goes from 3.2 to 2.1. And the increased exposure is very similar, in fact. And so this was kind of an interesting surprise to us. But to give you a sense of what this means, if you haven't seen this kind of feeling thermometer scale, you may be wondering, well, what does 3 degrees on this scale mean? And if you take sort of the historical trend of how This measure has changed over the years since it was started being recorded. This is equivalent to a change in polarization of about 3 years. Right? So we are talking about sort of a week-long intervention, and so you can sort of hypothesize how this may extend to a longer period. Okay, so that was kind of our main outcome, affective polarization. What happens to emotions when we have this kind of intervention? So in the moment, in the feed, people actually, when they saw less polarizing content, less APA, they felt less angry and less sad in the moment, and we didn't find any effects on excited and calm. When we increased exposure to alpha, we found the opposite effect. So people feel angrier and more sad, no effect on excited and calm. But interestingly, and perhaps maybe not too surprisingly for people who have spent a lot of time measuring emotions, these were all short-lived effects. We did not see any pre and post effect just in the moment. So this is unlike the affective polarization case. Okay. So now the obvious question was, well, you found effects or you managed to sort of reduce affective polarization. What kind of effect does this have on engagement? And so I will start by saying that we sort of thought of uh, two main ways of measuring engagement. The first one is volume. In other words, how often do people engage with their feed? So how much time do they spend? How many posts they view? How many likes they give? How many reposts? And then we looked at the rate, which is out of all the things that they saw, how often they were liking or reposting those posts. Okay, so that's kind of the frame that I'll give you here. And so, interestingly, we found that people who were in this reduced exposure condition, so they were seeing less polarizing content, in fact, spent less time browsing their feed. And as a result, saw fewer views. So here, this is the treatment effect of how many posts they have seen across the experiment in this 7-day period. And then they also just liked fewer posts in absolute terms. And we did not see significant effects on the number of reposts, but this is a more rare engagement. And so perhaps that's why we're not seeing any effects. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the rate at which people like and repost things, given those that they have seen, we find that people actually like and repost content more at a higher rate than those in the control conditions. So overall, the number of likes and reposts are smaller, but then the rate of engagement is a little higher. So, not a sort of a not very clear story. There is no just simply negative effects, right? So there is this sort of suggests that maybe the kind of content that people consume is a little bit higher quality and more meaningful to them. And so in the increased exposure condition, we did not find any effects. And this is likely because it's, as I said at the beginning, this is a little bit of a lighter intervention. We bumped the increased exposure a little bit. It was just less strong of an intervention. So that's engagement. Interestingly, we pre-registered looking at different moderators, so how the treatment varies across um, uh, party and different demographics. And in fact, we did not find any heterogeneity, both in our in-feed and our pre-post analysis, which suggests that the treatment affected everyone similarly. Um, I want to mention a couple of limitations just to be careful. And the first one is we looked at only partisans and people who have enough political content. Um, we also sort of focused on this time that was the lead up to a big election. In some sense, elections are an ideal time to test this kind of interventions just because there is more politics during that time, but it may hurt the generalizability. So one of the things that we're wondering about is like how these effects would translate to another time. Though, a lot of people say, there is always some political tension these days. We ran just a 7-day intervention, 10-day experiment, so it's unclear whether this kind of effects will be sustained. And lastly, we just limited to one platform. So this is just X during a specific period of time. But with all of that, my sort of high-level summary is to say that, modulating sort of the exposure to APA, this polarizing content, has an impact on affective polarization. I'll skip through these slides because I want to make sure I give you some time to ask questions, but I wanted to leave you with just two things. One is we see this idea of having the browser extensions to for running feed ranking experiments is very promising, and hope that in fact others have already picked this up. Out of Berkeley, there is some colleagues have ran a challenge where people could propose their own interventions, and they ran an experiment with the selected feed rankers. In fact, my students and I proposed one where we tried to up-rank bridging content. And this was one of the 3 interventions that they tested. And so now they're analyzing the data, and so hopefully there will be some results soon. But in general, we see this as a very important opportunity for future work in this area. And the last thing I want to mention is, if you think about all the design space of how you may design a feed ranking algorithm, the space that the platforms are actually comfortable exploring is very small. And whether this is because of conflicting incentives or fear of backlash, but it's relatively small. In fact, the real design space is much bigger, right? And these kind of tools, like the one that I just described, I think allow us to explore this area and see what we can do and how these different designs would affect various important outcomes. And I would argue that AI and large language models have expanded this space even further, because now we can think about not just engagement but also content. And so the hope is that this is a very exciting time to do this kind of research, test bold ideas of things that the platforms cannot try, and try to articulate new visions of how these platforms could operate. And the hope is that if we do show that there are different designs, that we could build support for these alternative ways to design the platforms. So teşekkür ederim, and I'm excited to open for questions.
Thank you so much, Martin, for this fantastic presentation. I already have a question in my chat box, so I will start with that one. And in the meantime, I
Thanks, yeah.
invite our audience to send their questions to me. Starting with Yunus Emre. Thank you so much for this presentation. My question is, your results show measurable effects after only 10 days. Do you think these changes reflect temporary emotional reactions, or could they actually reshape longer-term political attitudes?
It's an excellent question. And the honest answer is we don't know. Based on the data we have, it's very difficult to say. But I think, in general, when people think about these kinds of experiments, and this is sort of something that's very common to people, is very familiar to people in industry who run these kinds of experiments, is that, when there might be some novelty effects. So there will be some effect at the beginning, and then people habituate and go back to baseline, essentially. And so that might be happening. We cannot rule that out. But that being said, and I don't want to steal the thunder of this larger experiment that the folks out of Berkeley ran. So they ran this experiment for 3 months. And in some arms, they see similar results. And so, you'll read more when that paper is out. But I feel confident that maybe maybe the effects will not be as strong. But I do think that some of it will be retained. And it's kind of interesting when you are changing one social media platform, and just to be clear, they actually ran this on 3 platforms at the same time, so Facebook, Reddit, and Twitter. People may substitute. So you see a lot of that in the deactivation studies. So for example, if you pay people to not use Facebook, they will go use Instagram, or they will go use Twitter more. And so there is this question of, if you change it on one platform, what happens in these terms of substitution? that may have a similar effect. And so, all to say, we know very little about this, and I think now that we have these tools, it's an exciting time to run these longer experiments.
Thank you. The next question is from Alpata. What might be the limitations of measuring partisanship in a Republican slash Democratic framework? How might results change if you consider, for example, partisanship based on far left slash far right parties?
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think, sort of slightly baked into that question is, if I would guess, it's this question of, well, the US is you have a very specific system, right? And where you have, Republicans, just really two sides. Um, of course, there is a sort of a scale there. There are extremes on both ends. One thing that we saw in terms of how the effect that the intervention had on different people was that how strong their partisanship was did not have an effect on did not change how what effect the intervention had. So that's all to say that people who reported being having that their partisan identity is much more important to them. They were sort of strong partisans, as they're called, did not experience significantly different effect than people who did not say that was an important part of their identity. So in that sense, I don't think that things will change that much. But I think you're also asking, well, maybe the measurement should change, and I think that's a very good question. And frankly, I'm kind of curious how this would how would even both the measurement and the intervention change in a different context, essentially, whether it's a different country and frankly even a different time. Yeah, excellent question.
Thank you, Martin. The next question is from Salih Nur. Thanking you very much for your presentation. My question is regarding the interaction between your intervention and the platform's native algorithm. Since you are re-ranking the feed externally via a browser extension, I was wondering if X's own For You algorithm picks up the user's altered engagement patterns. For example, the lack of engagement with AAPA content because they simply don't see it as a signal to permanently recalibrate their primary interest profile. It's a rather long question. In other
No,
words,
it's a great question, and I wish I know the answer. And it's something we have been wondering about. A lot of this kind of comes down to the mechanics of how things work in the background. Well, both on the browser. So, like, what does Twitter record? I think they're still able to record the view events, just like you mentioned. So they are able to see that people to know that people are seeing something else, and if they clicked on or liked some of those, they record those. And you're absolutely right. This may affect their, the parameters and how they're seen in the algorithm on the other side. What's the time scale at which they are adjusting this is unclear to me. So I don't know whether this 7 days was enough for us to for our intervention to have nudged the algorithm and how people and what people see just on its own. But it's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer.
thank you. The next question is from Elida. The browser extension re-ranks in real time. How did you validate the LLM classifier's precision was high enough to not introduce noise into your treatment? Misclassified podcasts could dilute or contaminate the effect, shouldn't they?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So it's something that we were very intentional and spent a lot of time with, and exactly for the reason that you're describing. Sort of if your intervention is not well designed or your models make mistakes, you won't have you won't induce essentially the variation that you want to induce. So very, very important. I'll say so before we ran this study, a subset of my collaborators actually ran a survey experiment in which they showed people, they rearranged sort of the feeds. Instead of their own feeds, it was just a curated feed where they had this kind of content up-ranked or down-ranked. And during that process, they developed they spent a lot of time thinking about the classifiers. And then in the second study, we spent even more time. But just to give you a sense of like how we thought about um, the quality of the LLM predictions was that if we had two of us, two experts, if you will, label the posts, and if we had the LLM, if you compare the two of us, we would disagree about as much as we would each disagree with the LLM, right? So that's all to say that these are hard things to classify sometimes, and even people may disagree. But the language model did not disagree with the experts more than they disagreed with each other. So, in some sense, and the fact that we are finding effects suggests that we are sort of capturing something. But as I said, these things are not perfect. So. And that's partly one of the strategies for having eight different factors. So, even if you get it wrong on one or two of them, you really need at least four for something to become flagged as APA. And so you sort of have more chances you need to make a very big error in order to misclassify things, I would say. But great question. I mean, that's kind of the heart of the intervention. And so thinking about it is really important.
Thank you. Our next question is from Sheval. Thanking you very much. I'm wondering if platforms reduce exposure to partisan content to decrease polarization, could this also reduce user engagement?
Yeah, yes. As I said in the results, we see a reduced in absolute terms. We see that people spend a little less time when you reduce exposure to this kind of content. But we see that actually among the things that they are exposed to, they are much more likely to positively engage with them. And so, as I said earlier, it's not sort of a clear story that this just reduces. It reduces overall engagement, but increases rates. And so, how are you going to take that? It depends on sort of what the platform's bottom line or sort of top line metrics are and what the things that they care about. I want to mention something that I think has been very useful, at least for me, to think about these effects in the context of engagement, which is that, oftentimes what the platforms really want to achieve, or like what they ought to want to achieve, was not just maximizing this kind of short-term engagement, which to some extent may be hurt by these kinds of interventions, but to think about this sort of user satisfaction in the long term. And so it's not difficult to imagine, and I don't have data to support this, but my intuition is that if you have actually, if you show people content that they appreciate more, and that they, as I said, that are more likely to positively engage with, even if that engagement is lower in volume, they're more likely to be satisfied with the platform long term. And so that may sort of lead them to be more engaged overall, or at a longer time scale. And it's funny, we thought through this with the team, and one of the things that one of my colleagues mentioned that I thought was a great point was that, not only that people regret seeing some, not liking to see this kind of content long term or impacting how satisfied they are with the platform. Oftentimes people don't like it even short after. Like I encourage you to think like how many times you have like scrolled through social media and then right after you're like, oh gosh, why did I spend this much time doing this, right? And so it's kind of useful to think about how to make this experience a little bit more meaningful.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Barke. My question is regarding annotating social media data in general. We
Mhm.
are used to categorical labels, but as the complexity of algorithms increase, I feel like it becomes harder and harder to understand what group of posts belong in the same, similar, or opposite categories. How do you handle blurry in between situations during annotation?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, the way it's so interesting. This comes up so often with various analysis that we do. My high level thinking about that is, I guess I'll kind of mention two things. One is um, there is a question of how much something is truly unclear in the sense that two people may reasonably disagree, right? There is some sense of subjectivity in the labeling task. And a lot of important things that we measure may be subjective, right? I think toxicity might be one interesting example, something that one of us finds offensive, another may not, right? And there is a level of subjectivity, and yet, it's not that we shouldn't measure it, but there is some level of disagreement. And in those cases, I like to think about, well, how can be specific about the construct? So when people or machines label it, we are more likely to be accurate in the way and increase sort of the inter-annotator agreement. Um, but in any case, I think it's important to understand how much do people agree and how difficult this task is overall. And that's partly why I kind of framed my earlier response to the question of like, so well, how good is your classification to be in the sense of, well, here's how much people agree with each other, and here's how much they agree with the LLM. One thing that has been sort of useful, another hint that I'll mention here is that when we are annotating something as people, I usually want to make sure that we don't need to take too many sort of contextual steps to say like, oh, probably someone said this because of this and that, this thing meant that probably they believe in this. Like if you need to get into people's heads to figure out what's the label of the content, probably you shouldn't do that. Essentially, what can you just say based on what's in the content itself, and not sort of make a lot of this kind of logical steps to get to the label. And I think that ends up being a good way to bring the inter-annotator agreement up, and sort of have a more consistent labeling, importantly.
Thank you. I have one more question in the chat box, and those of you who haven't had a chance to write that up, you can still put that in your box, by the way, to my students. Well, that's from Nima. I have a question about operationalization of emotions, such as happiness, sadness, or excitement. Were these emotions derived from observational platform data, or were they captured directly through user-reported inputs?
User reported. Yeah, excellent question. So this is all we literally asked them. And we inserted, as I said, this in-feed surveys, and asked them, how do you feel in the moment? Sometimes this is called, oh, I forget, like experience sampling, right? Where you just in the moment ask people how do they feel. And then in the pre and post surveys, and this is a common practice. One of our collaborators, Jeannie, has spent her whole career studying emotions. And so the way that people ask these kind of questions in a survey is things like over the last week or a given time period, how much did you feel XYZ, sad, angry, excited, and so on. So we are really just asking people, not inferring anything from the content.
Okay, thank you so much. As I don't see, I mean, I hope I didn't miss anyone's questions. So with that, I think we can conclude the session by thanking Martin so very much. Well, actually, there's one last question. Well, I'm gonna
Go
ask
for it.
first.
Go
Should
for
I?
it. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So it is from Mehmet asking, perhaps you discussed this during the presentation and I missed it, but I was wondering, you operationalize anti-democratic attitudes through eight specific factors. Do you think using a different theoretical framework could lead to alternative ways of measuring polarization?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And as I said during the presentation, there are many reasonable ways to define polarizing content. Uh, Essentially, like the question that I posed at the beginning was like, if we were to model the direct link between content and affective polarization, you can probably think of many ways to measure it. We decided to use this one just because we wanted to build on this very solid social scientific research that people have done, and so that was one of the things. There were so many other things we wanted to do that we really didn't want to invent many new things in that area. But one thing I'll say is that another kind of measurement that we did was, as I said in this Berkeley organized study, was that we looked at bridging content. So content in which both left and right-leaning participants are likely to positively engage, right? And frankly, none of these measures are perfect, and I think there is definitely room to think about different sort of theoretical frameworks more broadly.
Thank you so much. So with that, I will thank you for this really fascinating presentation and for the thoughtful discussion that followed. And of course, thanks as well to everyone who participated and contributed to the discussion. With that, I'll actually pause our recording.